How does a family lose everything in one night? Their savings cleared, their plans destroyed, and a luxury car appearing out of nowhere with no explanation. When officers stepped into the Coleman home at 10:52 p.m., they found Derek on the kitchen floor, shaking, unable to steady his words. The 911 call was still active. The house looked ordinary, but the situation wasn't. And investigators began with the only question that made sense. What happened to the money this couple spent years building? And why did it end with a car they never agreed on?
530, we're north of the alleyway, 53rd Street, Marty Mercy 5.
On the night of June 11, 2024, just a few minutes before the clock touched 10:52 p.m., a call came in to Tampa Dispatch that did not match the usual tone of late-night emergencies. The operator expected the familiar rush of frantic voices, the sound of someone shouting for help, or the chaos that usually follows a home invasion or medical scare. But instead, she heard a single breath, slow, shaky, and almost unwilling to be released. And then a whisper, barely loud enough to register, "Please, send someone." The line didn't disconnect. It stayed open, carrying the sound of a house holding its breath. That small detail forced every responder to move faster, because silence tends to hide the most painful truths. When the first officers arrived at the Coleman residence on Whisper Ridge Lane, they found the front door pushed halfway inward, as though someone had opened it in the middle of a thought and simply never came back to finish what they started. The porch light was on, flickering slightly, casting uneven shadows across the walkway. A pair of sandals sat near the door, one turned upside down as if someone had kicked it off in a hurry. The officers stepped inside, expecting confusion or panic, but what met them instead was an unsettling stillness that made even seasoned responders pause. Something felt wrong the second they crossed the threshold, and the deeper they walked into the home, the more that feeling strengthened. They moved toward the kitchen, because that's where the faint noise seemed to come from. A soft, unsteady sound that hovered between a gasp and a whimper. The moment the first officer stepped into the room, his breath caught. Blood streaked the tiles in chaotic patterns, as if someone had frantically reached for balance or escape. A knife lay near the center of the floor, glinting under the overhead light. The 911 call was still active, the operator faintly repeating, "Sir, are you there? Stay on the line. Help is already inside." And then, by the lower cabinet, they saw him, Derek Coleman, 42 years old, maintenance supervisor, known by everyone on his street for being quiet, polite, and reliable. He sat against the cabinet door with his knees drawn in, his hands trembling uncontrollably, his shirt stained with more than exhaustion. His eyes were hollow, almost refusing to focus, and all he could manage was a broken whisper. "She took everything." The officers tried to coax more words out of him, but nothing else came. The words he repeated had no detail, no context, no clear connection to the scene unfolding around them. Yet the weight in his voice left one question hanging in the room like smoke that refused to fade. What could make a man as steady as Derek break this violently? The house didn't answer. The silence didn't help. And the night wasn't offering explanations. Whatever had happened inside those walls had unfolded minutes before they arrived, but the truth was buried beneath layers of choices, secrets, and moments no one outside this home had witnessed. And that was what drew investigators deeper. This wasn't a robbery. This wasn't an accident. Something far more personal had ripped through this family, and the officers felt it before they even knew the names tied to the blood on the floor. But to understand the weight of that night, the story has to move backward, to the days when nothing looked out of place and the cracks were small enough for even close friends to miss. The Colemans had always been the couple people pointed to as strong and steady. Their neighbors saw them grilling in the yard on warm Sundays, sharing plates of ribs and laughter as families passed by. Those same neighbors remembered how Derek always wore his old work boots, scuffed from years of labor, while Alyssa wore bright sundresses that made her stand out in every group photo. At church, they sat side by side, smiling politely through sermons, and greeting fellow members with warm nods. They held hands during prayer. They joined potlucks. They left before anyone noticed the tension behind their smiles. In pictures, they looked happy. In public, they looked unified. But real life has a way of hiding its deepest fractures behind ordinary routines. There were signs, small, quiet moments tucked into everyday life that showed the truth long before anyone admitted it aloud. Derek would come home exhausted, his shirt smelling like machine oil, and Alyssa would glance at him with a look that wasn't admiration anymore. It was impatience. When they hosted neighbors, Alyssa's smile sharpened whenever Derek took too long to answer a question or moved slower than her liking. "You're too slow," she once snapped under her breath, thinking no one heard. Derek heard. He always heard. At the gym where Alyssa worked part-time, something shifted. She started taking more pictures of herself, posed, polished, angled perfectly for social media. Pictures meant to create an illusion of a life more exciting than the one she shared at home. Neighbors noticed she spent extra time outside taking photos instead of eating with Derek on the patio. A savings jar labeled "New Life" sat on their shelf, decorated by both of them years earlier, when the dream of moving near the coast felt like a shared mission. But the jar had become more of a symbol than a plan, and Alyssa rarely looked at it anymore. Derek still did. Every day. And then there was the moment that, in hindsight, should have raised more questions. One afternoon, Alyssa was closing up the gym when a man passed by the front desk. Tall, confident, the type who carried himself like he expected attention and usually received it. His name was Trent, though Derek didn't know that then. No one did. What mattered wasn't the introduction. It was the way Alyssa looked at him for a second too long. A look she tried to hide, quickly brushing a strand of hair behind her ear, as if she could pin the moment away. She deleted the first set of messages she exchanged with him not long after that day, but the habit stuck. Delete, clear, erase, start fresh. She believed she was covering breadcrumbs. She didn't realize she was creating a trail. Their marriage, at least the one people saw, was already ending. But endings don't always explode. Sometimes they fade out quietly before anyone notices they've already arrived. By the time the real unraveling began, the Colemans were still sleeping under the same roof, but living separate lives. Derek didn't see it at first, because he believed loyalty was stronger than drift. Alyssa felt it every day but refused to face it, because facing it meant confronting a truth she didn't want to name. So the cracks widened in silence. And silence, in homes like this, can be far louder than arguments. The first real shift happened in the weeks before June. It began with small changes. Alyssa wearing clothes Derek had never seen, choosing outfits that matched the boldness of a life she wasn't living at home. He asked once casually, "New dress?" She smiled and said, "Yeah, I thought I deserved something nice." Derek didn't push the comment. He admired her. He didn't think to question her. But people notice patterns even when they try not to. Her work hours suddenly stretched longer. She claimed the gym needed more help. She started leaving earlier, returning later. And one night, she didn't come home at all. When Derek asked the next morning, she explained it away with a story about an overnight training camp for gym staff. He believed her because trust was all he had. But trust can blind even the strongest observer. When his phone buzzed a few days later with a notification about a small withdrawal from their savings, he shrugged it off. Another came. And another. $20, $50, $35. Withdrawals too small to trigger panic but too frequent to ignore. He asked Alyssa once. She brushed it off with a light laugh, saying she bought something for the house. There was no something. And that laugh wasn't light. It was practiced. Confusion turned to quiet worry, and worry turned to deeper tension. Friends from church began whispering, careful, hesitant whispers. One woman told Derek she thought she saw Alyssa with a gym guy in the parking lot, but she wasn't sure. A neighbor said Alyssa seemed distant lately. A co-worker of Alyssa's claimed she adored Derek and wouldn't do anything to hurt him. Her sister said she had been unhappy for years. And Trent? When asked later, he claimed he barely knew her. even though messages would eventually prove otherwise. Everything became a maze of conflicting truths. Every voice contradicted another. Every explanation carried a different tone, and no one, not even Derek, could trace the exact moment when their life began slipping out of his hands. But the pattern kept forming, one shaky line at a time, pulling Derek toward a discovery that would end with a house full of blood and a man whispering, "She took everything." Before that night arrived, though, one thing became clear. Someone in this story wasn't telling the truth. And the deeper investigators dug, the more obvious it became that the truth wasn't buried under one lie, but under many. If you're finding this story gripping so far, stay with us, and when you're done, share it with someone you care about. Sometimes the stories we hear protect us from the choices we don't see coming. In the days leading up to June 11th, 2024, the tension inside the Coleman household tightened in ways that weren't loud enough for the neighborhood to notice, but heavy enough for Derek to feel every time he walked through the door. He was a man who lived by routine: morning coffee at 6:15, work boots on by 6:25, engine running at 6:30. He found comfort in knowing what the day demanded, and for years, his marriage fit inside that rhythm. But something had shifted, and the shift wasn't explosive or dramatic. It was quiet, steady, the kind of change that slips through the cracks before anyone realizes it has rearranged the whole foundation. Derek watched it happen, but he didn't understand it. And Alyssa moved through those days as if she didn't see the growing distance at all. One morning, she walked past him wearing perfume he couldn't name. It lingered in the hallway long after she left, mixing with the scent of laundry detergent and old wood varnish. Derek noticed, but he forced himself not to ask. He didn't want to seem paranoid. He didn't want to believe anything was wrong. Yet he couldn't ignore the way she avoided his eyes when she said she had another late shift at the gym. The excuse was familiar by then, and even though it made little sense, gyms rarely schedule overnight responsibilities. He nodded, pretending the unease wasn't eating away at him. He wanted to trust her because trust had always been his default, even when his instincts begged him to question the small inconsistencies that kept appearing. By the start of May, the small financial alerts became more frequent. They were always modest amounts, $50 here, $60 there, but they added up quickly. Derek stared at each transaction, trying to match them to groceries or household needs, but nothing fit. When he asked Alyssa directly, she brushed him off with a smile that looked trained rather than genuine. "Don't worry about that," she said. "I've got it handled." But she didn't say what it was, and Derek didn't push for an answer, though he regretted that hesitation later. The truth often hides behind the questions we're too scared to ask, and fear has a way of keeping people silent until silence becomes a cage. The whispers from friends grew louder as the weeks passed. Someone from their church mentioned seeing Alyssa dressed up far more glamorously than usual, stepping into a car they didn't recognize. A neighbor hinted that she'd been spending more time outside late at night, talking softly on her phone with her back turned toward the house. Even the gym staff seemed unsure of her whereabouts at times, telling Derek that schedules had changed, though no one could say exactly when or why. These stories didn't match, yet they all pointed in the same direction. A direction Derek didn't want to face. Every new detail chipped away at his confidence, but he kept hoping for an explanation that made sense. Something that would anchor him back into the life he thought he was living. Alyssa's behavior continued shifting, as if she had become two people sharing the same body. At home, she moved with impatience, rolling her eyes at small mistakes and brushing past Derek with a dismissive wave. Her tone grew sharper, and her affection faded until even simple greetings felt strained. Yet whenever they stepped outside, into church parking lots, grocery stores, or community events, she switched seamlessly into charm. She held Derek's arm. She smiled for photos. She laughed loudly and leaned into him as if nothing were wrong at all. Those who saw them together would think they were stable, even thriving. But public warmth can mask private distance, and the distance inside their home had stretched far beyond what either of them acknowledged. The first major incident happened on a Thursday night when Alyssa claimed she needed to attend a mandatory work retreat. It came out of nowhere, and Derek felt an immediate sting of confusion. The gym industry didn't typically require overnight trips, and everything about the explanation felt manufactured. But he forced himself to accept it, telling himself that doubt would only make things worse. She left with a small suitcase and didn't return until the following afternoon, claiming exhaustion and irritation over pointless meetings. Yet the suitcase didn't look used. Her clothes didn't smell like hotel detergent. And the exhaustion she claimed looked more like someone trying to piece together a story before being questioned. Derek didn't confront her, but the seed of suspicion grew deeper, taking root in ways that changed how he saw every small detail after that night. By early June, Derek began noticing small changes in their closet. Clothes he had never seen appeared out of nowhere. Tight dresses, designer heels, jackets with bold colors. He asked casually, "When did we get this?" And Alyssa responded with a vague, "I've had that for months," even though he knew she hadn't. She also started leaving the house with makeup that looked more glamorous than the natural style she used to prefer. It wasn't vanity, it was reinvention. She seemed to be building a version of herself that didn't fit the life they shared, and Derek felt it, even if he couldn't articulate it. The transformation wasn't sudden, it was gradual, the kind of change someone makes when they're stepping into a different world, one small decision at a time. Then came the bank notices that couldn't be ignored. Larger withdrawals started appearing, hundreds at a time. Derek's heart sank every morning he checked the account. He had spent 2 decades saving with discipline, sacrifice, and patience, and watching those numbers decrease without explanation felt like someone was taking pieces of his future and scattering them into the wind. He finally confronted Alyssa more directly, asking where the money was going. She answered calmly, far too calmly, reminding him they had always wanted new opportunities and that she was handling things behind the scenes. The words should have soothed him, but they didn't. They sounded rehearsed, they sounded detached, and they didn't match the reality he saw unfolding before his eyes. Conflicting stories from the people around Alyssa made everything more confusing. Her coworker insisted Alyssa adored Derek, speaking highly of him, and always wearing her wedding ring. Her sister, however, claimed Alyssa had been unhappy for years and believed she deserved more excitement in her life. Trent, when asked later, insisted he barely knew Alyssa at all, even though witnesses had noticed them exchanging glances that lingered longer than normal. Each voice created a different version of Alyssa, and none of those versions matched the woman Derek thought he knew. The truth dissolved in contradictions, and Derek was left trying to assemble a picture with pieces that didn't belong to the same puzzle. As June 11th approached, the emotional distance between them widened to a point where even small conversations felt strained. Derek tried to bring up their future plans, moving near the coast, building a small auto repair shop, creating a life that felt peaceful and fulfilling. But Alyssa brushed off those dreams as if they were childish fantasies. She rolled her eyes when he mentioned budgeting. She scoffed when he talked about saving. An undercurrent of resentment colored every interaction, and Derek couldn't understand why the dreams they once shared now seemed to irritate her. He tried to hold on to hope, clinging to the belief that the tension would pass. But something in Alyssa had shifted permanently, and Derek felt himself slipping out of her world without warning. On the morning of June 10th, the day before everything collapsed, Derek woke up early before work and sat alone at the kitchen table. He stared at the savings numbers again. The $380,000 was no longer there. All he saw was $74.26. He was hoping for clarity, but hope didn't bring back the missing money. He sipped his coffee slowly, the bitterness settling on his tongue, reflecting the ache he felt inside. When Alyssa entered the room, she barely acknowledged him. She picked up her phone, scrolled through messages he wasn't allowed to see, and left without saying goodbye. Her distance wasn't new, but the coldness behind it hit him harder than usual. And in that moment, Derek felt something inside him shift. Not anger, not rage, but a quiet dread. He sensed something coming, something heavy, something he couldn't define, but the feeling stayed with him the entire day. When investigators looked back, they realized the most painful truth. The story of the Coleman household wasn't a story of sudden downfall. It was a story of slow unraveling, a story built on moments no one noticed until it was too late. By the time the police stepped into that home at 10:52 p.m., the emotional collapse had already taken place long before the physical one. Each small withdrawal, each late-night excuse, each deleted message had built the invisible staircase that led Derek to the floor, where officers found him. And every person tied to this story had contributed a different shade of truth, creating a picture that refused to stay still. Nothing inside this home was as steady as it looked. The truth was fractured, the trust was gone, and the night of June 11th was only the final consequence of everything that came before. If this story has you locked in already, stay with us, and when this ends, share it with someone you care about. Sometimes the danger we overlook is the one happening right beside us. The morning after the incident, detectives gathered in a cramped conference room at the Tampa Police Department, surrounded by whiteboards filled with timelines, printed photos, and handwritten notes taped in crooked lines that reflected the confusion of the first few hours. They knew one thing for certain: whatever happened in that kitchen wasn't random. Derek wasn't the kind of man who cracked easily, which meant something or someone had pushed him to a point he never should have reached. They decided to begin by identifying everyone who had been connected to Alyssa in the months leading up to her death, starting with the person whose name had already been whispered through the neighborhood long before police even stepped inside the home. And that name was Trent Matthews. Detectives visited the upscale gym where Alyssa worked part-time, scanning through the staff list and client logbooks until one photo caught their attention. Trent, the trainer everyone described as charming and confident, stood with a posture that suggested he had mastered the art of being admired. He was taller than most, with an athletic build and a habit of looking directly into cameras, as if he was aware of how well he photographed. When detectives asked about him, employees exchanged glances before speaking, and that kind of hesitation always raised red flags. Some said he was friendly, overly friendly at times, especially with female clients. Others said he had a way of making people feel seen, even when they shouldn't have been seeking his attention. And more than one person admitted they had noticed him around Alyssa often, too often for it to be coincidence. But when detectives called him in for questioning, Trent sat calmly with his hands folded and said he barely knew her, brushing off every implication with a polite tone that felt rehearsed. But Trent wasn't the only person on their list. Detective Marissa Gomez, a sharp, meticulous investigator with 7 years on the force, noticed something odd in Derek's employment record: a documented workplace dispute. Months earlier, Derek had a heated argument with a coworker named Ronnie Talbot, a forklift operator who had a reputation for short tempers and long grudges. The report described the confrontation as escalated, with Ronnie threatening to get even after Derek reported him for reckless behavior. When detectives visited the warehouse, Ronnie shifted uncomfortably under their questions, insisting he had nothing to do with Alyssa or the couple's private life. But coworkers quietly mentioned that Ronnie had bragged about having dirt on people who think they're better than him, and that comment alone made detectives suspicious enough to keep him on their list. Then came Kayla Underwood, Alyssa's longtime friend turned occasional enemy. Kayla was blunt, emotional, and openly critical of Alyssa's choices, especially in the months leading up to the murder. She told detectives she believed Alyssa was chasing the wrong things: attention, validation, and quick thrills, and she resented the way Alyssa treated Derek. Neighbors remembered a heated argument between the two women in front of the Coleman home not long before the tragedy, with Kayla shouting that Alyssa was throwing away a good man for nonsense. That confrontation stuck with detectives, because Kayla admitted she never liked the way Alyssa flaunted things online, and she openly said she wished Derek saw his worth before she ruined him. Her honesty felt raw, not calculated, yet jealousy has shaped darker motives in other cases. The last person on their initial suspect list didn't even have a full name attached to him, only a title Alyssa had casually mentioned to a coworker: "My investor." The coworker described him as a man in his 50s, dressed sharply and speaking confidently. Someone who claimed to be helping Alyssa with a secret project she was working on behind Derek's back. No one knew his real name, only that he visited the gym once, introducing himself as someone who backs people who deserve more. The co-worker dismissed it as Alyssa exaggerating, but detectives couldn't ignore the fact that she had been hiding financial movements. A mystery investor who appeared suddenly, then vanished, added another layer of uncertainty. Each suspect had motive, and each motive made sense only halfway. Too vague, too incomplete, too convenient. The board in the investigation room began to look like a jigsaw puzzle of personalities whose lives intersected at the wrong time, the wrong angle, and the wrong emotional circumstances. Detectives stared at the board in frustration because the suspects didn't overlap naturally. Nothing connected cleanly enough to form a full picture. And just when they thought they had reached the limits of what made sense, a bank transaction surfaced that didn't match anything they expected. The detectives paused, leaning closer to the screen as the numbers and timestamps revealed something explosive. But detectives were about to find a transaction that changed everything. And then the surveillance footage came in. The first major obstacle in the investigation came from a place detectives expected to rely on: the bank. When they requested the Coleman's account history, the bank's legal department hesitated, claiming they needed additional authorization because the withdrawals were unusual but not necessarily fraudulent. Detectives pushed back, explaining they were dealing with a homicide case, but the bank moved slowly, sending pieces of information that felt incomplete and frustratingly redacted. Days went by as detectives waited for documents, and each delay slowed their ability to build a coherent timeline. The longer they waited, the more chaotic the investigation became, and those early hours are often the most crucial in uncovering motives. At the same time, inside the evidence room, a mislabeling error added another layer of confusion. A phone retrieved from Alyssa's gym locker had been placed in a bag marked with the wrong date and time, mixing it with unrelated items from another case. While the mistake was quickly caught, it created doubt about whether any other items had been mislabeled, and the lead detective demanded a full recount of every piece of evidence collected so far. Stress rippled through the department, especially because they knew the media was already circling the story, waiting for a reason to criticize the investigation. Each hour wasted felt like losing ground in a race they couldn't afford to fall behind in. Meanwhile, Trent continued to complicate matters. He refused to provide his phone without a warrant, denied knowing Alyssa beyond casual greetings, and insisted he had no involvement in her personal or financial life. His calmness during questioning was unsettling. Not defensive, not angry, just controlled, as if he had practiced his responses beforehand. When detectives met him again for a follow-up interview, he asked for a lawyer before they even finished their first question, and that alone made them suspicious. His behavior didn't match someone who barely knew the victim. It matched someone hiding something carefully. The insurance paperwork only deepened the confusion. When detectives received a partial copy of the policy connected to the Colemans, they noticed the forms were incomplete, signatures appeared rushed, and the beneficiary lines didn't add up. They requested a full copy, but the company replied that additional verification was required before they could release the details. The delay fed into the growing sense that every corner of this case was tangled with half-truths and bureaucratic obstacles. The detectives felt like they were chasing shadows, pieces of information that kept moving just out of reach. Then came the first false closure. A junior detective believed they had cracked the case. Trent had pressured Alyssa into stealing the couple's savings in order to support him financially. The theory made sense on the surface, especially with Alyssa's increased spending and the unexplained withdrawals. But the idea fell apart the moment they discovered the Lamborghini had been purchased in Trent's name, and Alyssa paid for it entirely, including taxes, fees, and registration, with cash sourced directly from the Coleman accounts. Trent didn't spend $1 of his own money. He didn't even sign the purchase forms himself. Alyssa had done everything. Detectives circled back to Trent, now more confused than ever. If he didn't contribute money, and if nothing tied him financially to her theft, then what role did he play? The simplest answer was also the most devastating one. There was no coercion. She wanted to impress him. This realization marked one of the darkest turning points in the investigation. It meant Alyssa hadn't been manipulated into stealing from Derek. not in the way detectives initially believed. She had pursued the excitement willingly, pouring the savings she and Derek built over years into a fantasy she shared with someone who felt no responsibility toward her. And for detectives, this raised a chilling new question. If she was willing to give Trent a luxury car, what else had she been willing to destroy to keep him close? As the investigation continued, detectives began to map the emotional landscape leading up to the tragedy, and what they uncovered painted a picture far more complicated than simple betrayal. Derek had spent months feeling something slipping away from him, but every time he tried to address it, he was met with evasive answers, sudden mood swings, or cold silences that left him doubting his own perception. He was a man who built his life on stability, routine, hard work, and sacrifice, and the slow unraveling of his marriage left him humiliated and powerless in ways he didn't know how to articulate. His co-workers at the shipping company noticed the change immediately. One co-worker, John Mullins, recalled seeing Derek sitting alone in his truck during lunch breaks, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned rigid, staring straight ahead like he was trying to keep himself from falling apart. Derek had always been a steady presence, quiet, reliable, and polite, but in those weeks leading up to the tragedy, he became distant, distracted, and shaky. He dropped tools, forgot instructions, and looked constantly exhausted, as if he hadn't slept properly in weeks. When John approached him to ask if everything was okay, Derek simply shook his head and whispered, "Not really," but refused to elaborate. Meanwhile, Alyssa had shifted into an entirely different rhythm. She became bolder, more reckless, and more visibly enamored with the attention she received from Trent and others who admired her online. She posted photos of what she called self-care nights, posing with new jewelry or expensive beauty treatments she shouldn't have been able to afford. She bought new outfits weekly, sometimes daily, each one flashier than the last. She spent hours at the gym even when she wasn't scheduled to work, walking past mirrors slowly, checking her reflection with a confidence she had never displayed before. Friends noticed that she no longer mentioned Derek in conversations. Her life revolved entirely around admiration, compliments, and the thrill of feeling wanted. For detectives, this psychological contrast was crucial. Alyssa wasn't simply unhappy. She was addicted to validation, the kind that grows louder and more intoxicating the more someone chases it. And Trent, with his training, charm, and practiced attention, knew exactly how to feed that craving. He had built a quiet reputation for knowing which women were vulnerable to his praise and which ones were willing to give more than they received. Alyssa fit the pattern perfectly. But here's where the story turns even darker. Viewers often pity Derek because of his emotional pain and the betrayal he endured. And while much of that sympathy is warranted, detectives knew the story wasn't that simple. The same emotional collapse that pushed him into despair also created a dangerous instability inside him, one fueled by humiliation, loss, and a sense of being erased from the life he worked tirelessly to build. He became isolated, confused, and overwhelmed, trapped between wanting answers and fearing the truth he already suspected. This cocktail of emotions, desperation, betrayal, humiliation, and rage created a psychological storm that neither he nor Alyssa understood fully until it was too late. And while Alyssa flaunted her new life publicly, Derek internalized his suffering silently, allowing it to compound until the night everything finally broke with irreversible force. Before we move deeper into the investigation, take a moment to support this channel so we can continue sharing stories that help families recognize warning signs before tragedy strikes. Your engagement helps keep these important conversations alive and may even protect someone you care about from walking down a similar path. As detectives assembled the growing pieces of Alyssa's life, they believed they had a grasp on her behavior. Recklessness, hidden relationships, financial secrecy. But nothing prepared them for the file that slid across the conference table one humid afternoon. It arrived in a plain envelope from an insurance investigator who had been cross-checking policies related to the Coleman home after the homicide. Inside was a document the department didn't expect, a document that carried an immediate and chilling weight. It was a life insurance policy worth $750,000, listing Derek Coleman as the insured person. His signature, at least at first glance, appeared in the appropriate place. But detectives noticed something wrong instantly. The slant, the pressure, the spacing of the letters. Two officers exchanged a look of disbelief because they recognized what they were seeing. The signature had been forged. The deeper detectives dug, the more unsettling the truth became. Alyssa had set up a hidden credit line 3 months earlier, one Derek never knew existed, and she used that credit line to pay the policy premiums. She didn't connect the account to their joint finances, nor did she mention it during conversations with friends or coworkers. Each payment was made quietly, in cash, through online transfers routed through layers meant to conceal her involvement. When detectives traced the account's origin, they found it linked to a digital mailbox registered under a different last name. One investigators concluded she created specifically to hide the paper trail. It wasn't carelessness, it was strategy. Then came the next blow. A gym co-worker named Marina Silva, a woman who had always been polite but distant during previous interviews, finally opened up after being shown the insurance document. She told detectives that Alyssa had been talking about building a new life with someone and wanted a clean slate. When Marina hesitated, detectives encouraged her gently, and that was when she shared the detail that shifted the entire investigation. Marina said that during a late-night cleanup shift at the gym, she overheard part of a conversation between Alyssa and Trent. Their voices were low, but Marina distinctly remembered Trent saying, "You can't start a new life with old attachments. You have to invest in freedom." At the time, she thought nothing of it. Now everything made sense. Detectives replayed those words in their minds, the weight of them chilling and calculated. It wasn't simply an affair, nor was it a temporary infatuation. It was a blueprint for replacing her marriage with a fantasy she believed someone else promised her. Alyssa hadn't simply drifted away emotionally. She had been preparing for a future Derek wasn't meant to be part of. She wasn't planning a getaway, she was planning a replacement. And Derek's existence, in that imagined future, ended the moment she signed that forged document. This revelation shook even the most seasoned investigators. It reframed Alyssa's generosity toward Trent. The clothes, the attention, the money, the Lamborghini. None of it was impulsive. Every choice aligned with someone convinced she was building a new world, leaving the old one behind. And she believed that new world started with the man she thought loved her back. But detectives had no idea they were only standing at the edge of the darkest truth. The hardest revelation hadn't arrived yet. It was coming next. Fast, cold, and devastating. 2 days after Alyssa's death, while detectives were still sorting evidence and chasing contradictory statements, a call came in from a used luxury dealership on the outskirts of Tampa. The manager, a man named Eddie Ramirez, reported a sale that didn't sit right with him. A bright yellow Lamborghini Huracan sold off for far less than its value. He said the buyer seemed nervous and rushed, and the seller avoided questions that most owners answer proudly. Eddie said he called because he recognized the car from a news clip about the homicide. That car looked familiar, he told detectives. Too familiar. When the dealership sent over footage from its security cameras, detectives gathered around the monitor with the kind of quiet anticipation that comes before a storm. The screen flickered, then steadied, revealing a figure stepping out of the Lamborghini. He wore sunglasses despite the cloudy weather, moved quickly, and kept his head low. There was no hesitation in the way he handed the keys to an employee. No sentimental glance at the car he was parting with. No sign of emotion at all. When the camera zoomed in as he signed the paperwork, the room filled with a mix of shock and resignation. The man selling the Lamborghini was Trent. The dealership date stamp read June 13th, 2 days after Alyssa died. While detectives were questioning him, while news reporters were circling the Coleman home, while Derek was still in custody trying to explain what happened, Trent was already selling the Lamborghini she sacrificed everything to give him. Detectives watched the video again, this time slower, noticing an unsettling detail. He didn't appear shaken, or sad, or even cautious. He moved with the ease of someone who had done this before. A quick background check confirmed their suspicion. Trent had been involved with at least 4 other women in the past 5 years, each one describing a similar pattern. He charmed them, flattered them, promised a future, and then disappeared once their money or emotional investment ran dry. 2 women had filed complaints for fraud-like behavior, but dropped them because they were too embarrassed to pursue the case. Another woman admitted she drained her savings for him, then never heard from him again. And in each case, he walked away untouched because he never took money directly. Each woman had given it willingly. Alyssa wasn't his first victim. She was simply the most tragic. Detectives sat in stunned silence as the truth settled. Trent never planned to run away with Alyssa. He never intended to build a life with her. He didn't love her. He didn't dream with her. He didn't care about her. He saw her as an opportunity, a stepping stone, a temporary advantage, someone disposable. The heartbreaking irony? Alyssa destroyed her marriage, her reputation, her future, and indirectly sparked the events that led to her death, all for a man who walked away without a scratch. In that moment, detectives understood something chilling. The real villain was the man who never touched the knife. As detectives began to piece together Alyssa's choices, they expected the narrative to lean one direction, to paint her as a reckless woman who fell into the wrong arms. But the investigation had a second truth running beneath it, one they discovered slowly, reluctantly, and with heavy hearts. While Alyssa was chasing validation and fantasy, Derek was unraveling in ways no one saw clearly enough to stop. And once detectives understood both sides of the story, the emotional balance shifted. Neighbors recalled hearing Derek sobbing inside his truck days before the tragedy, his cries muffled but intense enough for people to pause mid-step. One neighbor, an older man named Gerald Patterson, said the sound carried the kind of pain you don't hear often, the kind that makes you want to knock on the window but keeps you frozen because you don't know what words can help. Gerald admitted he almost approached him, but walked away, convincing himself it was a private moment. "I regret that," he told detectives softly. Then detectives found a note in Derek's vehicle, a folded piece of paper tucked into the console. The handwriting was shaky, uneven, and full of emotional weight. It read, "She's choosing death." Detectives weren't sure whether he meant metaphorical death or something more literal, but the line showed a mind bent under unbearable pressure, unable to separate fear from reality. Digging further, detectives uncovered evidence that shifted the lens again. Derek had followed Alyssa more times than he admitted, trailing her from the gym, from restaurants, and sometimes parking blocks away to watch her walk to Trent's car. He kept videos, cell phone recordings of her laughing, touching Trent's arm, or stepping into his vehicle. The recordings weren't angry. They were desperate. His breath soft, shaky, sometimes accompanied by words whispered to himself like, "Why?" or "Please stop." It was the kind of obsessive surveillance born not from hatred, but from heartbreak that had nowhere else to go. As the detectives reviewed the footage, emotions in the room shifted from sympathy to discomfort, because love, when twisted through betrayal and desperation, becomes dangerous. And while Derek was undeniably wronged in ways that could break even the strongest person, there was something else happening inside him, something unsteady, something dark, something slowly poisoning him from the inside out. He wasn't simply a victim of Alyssa's choices. He was becoming a victim of his own collapse. He was both. A man destroyed by betrayal, and a man consumed by the weight of emotions he never learned to release. And that left viewers, and investigators, with a conflicted truth. Who do you feel for? The woman who made devastating choices out of insecurity and desire? Or the man whose suffering turned into something that changed everything forever? By the end of the day, investigators no longer knew who to root for. And neither will you. Before we move into the final act of this story, take a moment to let us know you're still here. Drop a comment sharing where you're watching from, and if you've made it this far, type "I'm still here" so we know who's following every twist with us. Your support helps keep these stories alive for the people who need to hear them most. The hours leading up to the confrontation were quiet. too quiet for a home that once held years of routines, shared meals, and late-night conversations. Derek returned from work before sunset, moving through the house as if each step weighed more than the last. He didn't turn on the TV. He didn't attempt to eat. He simply sat at the edge of the couch, hands clasped, staring at the doorway like he already knew something was coming. Outside, the neighborhood carried on with its usual evening rhythm. Cars pulling in, porch lights switching on, families settling into their nightly routines. But inside that home, the air felt heavy, like every emotion he had swallowed for months had risen to the surface all at once. As the clock approached 10:40 p.m., headlights drifted across the living room walls. Alyssa's car pulled into the driveway with the smooth, careless ease of someone who had no idea what waited inside. She entered the house while talking softly into her phone, her laughter sharp against the silence. When she saw Derek sitting there, she slipped the phone into her purse without finishing the call. Her expression tightened as if she was preparing for another argument she believed she could win. She took a step closer, then paused, sensing an intensity in the room that hadn't been there before. The distance between them felt wide, even though only a few feet separated them. Neighbors later told investigators they heard the argument shortly after she walked in. Raised voices, sharp words, and something else beneath it, something raw that didn't sound like the usual frustrations couples exchange. One neighbor said it was the kind of anger that sounds like crying, a description that would haunt the report for months. Derek finally asked the question he had held back for too long. Why, Alyssa? Why him? Why our money? But Alyssa, exhausted from balancing two different lives, answered with words that cut deeper than she intended. She told him she was tired of waiting, tired of living small, tired of building a life she didn't want anymore. Then she delivered the line that shattered him completely. "You'll never be enough for me, Derek. You never were." For a moment, the house went still. No yelling, no footsteps, no movement. Just the sound of two people standing in the ruins of a life they once promised to share. Witnesses said the noise stopped so suddenly that they thought the couple had walked outside. But inside that kitchen, something inside Derek collapsed. Investigators believe that he didn't rise with rage. He rose with heartbreak. Months of emotional bruising, betrayal, confusion, and humiliation converged in a moment he could no longer outrun. Alyssa took a step back, startled by the sudden shift in his expression. She tried to speak again, but the softness in her voice arrived too late. Detectives reconstructed the next moments through physical evidence and Derek's own fractured statements. He moved toward the counter, his mind unraveling under the weight of everything he had learned. The stolen savings, the forged insurance policy, the whispered promises she made to another man, and the realization that she had invested their entire future into someone who never intended to stay. The knife was on the counter, left over from an unfinished dinner earlier that week, and in the chaos that followed, just a few seconds, maybe less, every unspoken argument erupted at once. By the time the shouting stopped, the tragedy had already unfolded. Alyssa lay motionless on the kitchen floor, and Derek, stunned by the reality of what had happened, sank beside her as if his legs could no longer support him. He didn't run. He didn't hide. He reached for his phone with trembling hands and dialed 911. The call was frantic, broken, almost hard to follow. Dispatchers later said they struggled to understand his words at first because his voice kept catching, collapsing under its own weight. The only clear phrase that repeated again and again was the one he whispered when officers arrived. "She took everything. Everything." The first officers who stepped into the house found him sitting against the kitchen cabinet, his back pressed to the wood, his hands shaking uncontrollably. His clothes were soaked from holding her. His face showed a mixture of shock, grief, and emptiness, the look of a man who had finally realized the full cost of a moment he couldn't take back. One officer placed a hand on his shoulder, but Derek didn't respond. He stared at the floor as if replaying every choice, every unanswered question, every sign he ignored until the world he built collapsed in a single night. As Paramedics entered. The neighborhood gathered outside, whispering, confused, and unprepared for the tragedy unfolding behind the police tape. A home that once held laughter, plans, arguments, and reconciliation had become a crime scene illuminated by blue and red lights. And as the night deepened, the story that would soon make headlines had already begun, not with a criminal mastermind or a planned killing, but with two broken people standing at the crossroads of betrayal and despair. This was the moment that turned a quiet neighborhood into a tragedy. This was the night everything ended, and it would follow every person involved long after the lights faded. The trial began on a humid Monday morning in late March, the kind of morning where the air clings to your skin before the sun fully rises. And for many people in Tampa, it felt like the beginning of a story no one was ready to hear. News vans lined the courthouse steps before dawn, their bright screens glowing against the pale sky, each reporter eager to dissect every breath, every tremble, every expression connected to the Coleman tragedy. When deputies escorted Derek into the building, handcuffed and wearing a plain gray suit borrowed from the detention center, he looked like a man suspended between exhaustion and disbelief, someone who still hadn't figured out how he became the headline of a case that felt too big for the life he once lived. His steps were slow, not hesitant, but heavy, as though each one was burdened by memories he didn't know how to let go of, and the cameras followed him relentlessly because the world wanted to understand him, even though he struggled to understand himself. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere shifted from public spectacle to emotional reckoning, and the room carried a tension that made even casual movements feel disruptive. There were days when a trial feels like a ritual, predictable, procedural, and emotionally distant, but this wasn't one of those days. The judge, an older man named Harold McIntyre, adjusted his glasses with a slow, deliberate motion, the kind of gesture that conveyed he recognized the sensitivity of what lay ahead. Everyone in that room knew the facts. Alyssa was dead, Derek was responsible, and the details surrounding their marriage read like a warning about what happens when betrayal collides with desperation. But facts alone do not tell the story. The soul of the case lies in the emotions behind those facts, and that truth hung over the courtroom like a quiet storm. The prosecution opened with calm precision, framing Derek as a man who let heartbreak turn into violence, emphasizing every detail of the night Alyssa died. The lead prosecutor, Madeline Harper, a sharp, controlled attorney with a history of high-profile domestic cases, began with a steady voice. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she said, stepping toward them with measured steps, "this is not a complicated case. This is a case about choice. A tragic one. A dangerous one. A fatal one." She gestured toward Derek, who sat expressionless, hands clasped in front of him. Mr. Coleman chose rage. He chose to confront. He chose to take a life. Her tone didn't tremble, even when the weight of her words filled the room with a cold finality. But the defense countered with a story far more personal, far more painful, and far more complicated. Their attorney, Michael Barrett, was calm yet expressive, a man who understood that emotion can shape truth in ways evidence never could. He didn't attempt to deny Derek's actions. Instead, he focused on the months leading up to that night, the collapse of a man who had carried his pain silently until it crushed him from within. "This isn't a monster," Barrett said as he pointed to Derek. "This is a man who watched every dream he built dissolve in front of him. A man who was humiliated, abandoned, manipulated, and emotionally tortured until he broke. And when a person breaks, they don't always break cleanly." When Trent Matthews was called to the stand, the room changed. People leaned forward, some held their breath, and Derek, who had remained carved in stillness throughout most of the trial, lifted his gaze for the first time that day. Trent walked with the ease of someone stepping into a casual appointment, not a courtroom where a woman's death and a man's future were being examined under a microscope. His shoulders were back, his expression steady, his eyes unbothered. Even his clothing, a fitted navy shirt and tailored slacks, felt like a statement. He didn't dress like a man grieving or apologizing. He dressed like someone who expected attention. When asked to explain his relationship with Alyssa, Trent's answers were short and cold, each word delivered with a precision that made his detachment impossible to ignore. "We were friends," he said. "Did you encourage her to spend money on you?" the prosecutor asked. "People spend money how they want," Trent replied. "Did she ever tell you she was draining her marital savings?" "No." "Did you love her?" A pause, not of hesitation, but calculation. "I cared for her. Not the way people are assuming." Then came the line that forever shifted the mood in the courtroom. "Did you ask her for gifts? The car? The trips? The money?" And with the same steady tone he used for every answer before, Trent said, "She offered. I didn't make her." Those words struck the room like the sharp echo of a dropped gavel. Alyssa's mother, Denise, burst into tears, clutching her chest as if the air had been ripped from her lungs. Her sister turned away, face crumpling in grief and rage. Even the judge's eyes flickered with something difficult to interpret, a quiet disgust perhaps, or the recognition of a man who had never once confronted the wreckage his influence created. But the person who reacted the most quietly, and the most intensely, was Derek. He stared at Trent with an expression no one could fully decipher. It wasn't hatred. It wasn't fear. It was recognition. The recognition of a man who finally saw clearly the person who dismantled his marriage while pretending he didn't notice the destruction. The defense then brought forward expert witnesses who spoke about emotional collapse, presenting Derek as a man who tried everything to salvage his life before watching it crumble. A psychologist named Dr. Eleanor Briggs, calm and articulate, broke down the emotional deterioration she believed Derek experienced. "People think breakdowns happen in a moment," she said, "but they rarely do. Breakdown is the result of repeated emotional injuries, injuries that accumulate until a person no longer recognizes themselves." She explained how betrayal, financial ruin, humiliation, and isolation can compound into psychological paralysis. "Derek was losing his future," she continued. "Not slowly but violently, emotionally violently. Every pillar of his life collapsed at once, and the human mind can only endure so much before it shatters." Alyssa's family watched quietly, their emotions torn and tangled. They despised the affair. They despised the secrecy. Yet they couldn't excuse Derek for taking her life. The courtroom became a mirror of their conflict. Half grief, half rage, all heartbreak. At one point, Alyssa's father whispered, "We failed her, all of us." And though the words were not meant for anyone else, the sentiment rippled through the people nearby. When the jury finally received the case, the silence was suffocating. People held cups of water without drinking. Reporters typed without speaking. Family members stared at the doors as though answers might appear through them. Derek sat hunched forward, his hands clasped tightly enough that his knuckles turned pale. He didn't look at the jury box. He didn't look at the judge. He didn't look at anyone. It was as if he had retreated inside himself, preparing for a truth he couldn't avoid. Hours later, the jury returned. Their verdict: guilty of second-degree murder. A verdict that recognized his emotional collapse, but could not excuse his actions. When the judge finished, the room held its breath. Derek rose slowly, palms flat on the defense table, and asked to speak. His voice was steady but thin, the kind that comes from a chest scraped clean of denial. "I wasn't angry because she bought him a car. I was angry because she bought him the life I was still fighting for." The gallery went silent. No whispers, no shoes shifting against the floor, just the sound of someone swallowing hard in the second row. Alyssa's mother pressed a tissue to her mouth. Trent stared forward without blinking, as if he hadn't heard anything at all. Derek lowered his eyes, nodded once to the judge, and sat, like a man who finally understood that the truth he carried could not lighten the weight he now had to serve. And as deputies led him from the courtroom, the only sound was the faint echo of footsteps and the quiet sobbing of the people left behind. When the trial ended, the legal system closed its chapter, but the moral one remained wide open. Courts can deliver verdicts. They cannot deliver healing. and the questions left behind were heavier than any sentence printed on paper. If someone erased your entire future, everything you sacrificed for, what would you become? If someone betrayed you so deeply that you could no longer recognize your own life, how would you hold yourself together? If a manipulator pushed your marriage off a cliff, if a dreamer chased illusions until she burned her own world down, if a desperate man broke under pressure, who destroyed this family? These questions echoed through homes, break rooms, church pews, phone screens, and comment sections long after the courtroom emptied, because this story was not just about a crime. It was about human breaking points. When the verdict settled into the air like dust that refused to fall, the courtroom emptied with the slow, uneasy quiet of a place that had held too much pain. Families shuffled out first, heads lowered, arms linked loosely as if unsure of who needed support more. Journalists followed next, whispering among themselves, already drafting headlines that would travel farther than the truth ever could. And yet, after the noise faded, after the doors shut, after the reporters drove away, one question lingered louder than any closing statement. It was the kind of question that forces people to sit still for a moment longer than they planned. If someone took the life you fought for, not your job, not your money, but your entire sense of purpose, what would happen to the version of you holding on by a thread? It wasn't a question of guilt or innocence anymore. It was a question of human breaking points. The story of Derek and Alyssa wasn't a simple narrative of victim and villain, because neither of them fit perfectly into those roles. Alyssa made choices that wounded someone who loved her deeply, and Derek allowed that wound to fester until it became something monstrous, something beyond what he ever imagined himself capable of. And Trent, calm, calculated, unbothered, walked away without a scratch, without regret, without a single sign that he understood the harm he caused. This wasn't a triangle. It was a collision, and everyone involved carried scars that would never fade. Viewers across the country debated it endlessly, at dining tables, at office desks, in comment sections flooded with thousands of voices. Some believed Derek deserved life behind bars, arguing that nothing justified taking a life. Others sympathized, saying no one should be pushed to emotional collapse by betrayal and manipulation. Some blamed Alyssa for tearing apart her marriage. Others blamed Trent for pulling the strings with the kind of charm that hides rotten intentions. But beneath every opinion was a common thread. Something about this tragedy struck a deeply human nerve. And the moral questions didn't stop there. Was Derek a murderer? Or a broken man smashed beyond repair? Was Alyssa a villain? Or a vulnerable woman manipulated by someone who targeted her insecurities? Was Trent the architect of destruction, or simply a man who happened to be standing where the fault lines met? The narrator must ask, is betrayal ever a defense, or just an excuse that grows louder as the pain grows deeper? Because betrayal is a slow poison. It doesn't just hurt, it rearranges a person's understanding of themselves. It tells them they are not enough, not valued, not seen. And if a person already carries quiet insecurities, betrayal amplifies them until they echo uncontrollably inside the mind. And then there is the heaviest, most uncomfortable question. Who really destroyed this family? The manipulative man who played with emotions to get what he wanted? The dreamer who convinced herself she had found something better? Or the husband who broke under pressure and made a choice that changed everything forever? The truth is this: there is no single villain. There is no single victim. There is only pain, multiplied, layered, and tangled until nobody could untie it. And that is the moral weight of this story. It asks not for judgment, but for reflection. Because tragedies like this do not begin with violence. They begin with silence, insecurity, shame, and secrets that grow too heavy for fragile hearts to carry. Months after Derek's sentencing, the world had moved on, but the people directly affected had not. The courthouse no longer buzzed with tension. The reporters stopped calling. The news cycle swallowed the story and spit out new scandals, new crimes, new tragedies. But in a quiet cell on the east wing of the Florida State Correctional Facility, Derek lived in a rhythm that felt almost frozen in time. He woke early. He read whatever books the library cart brought. He worked in the laundry room. He ate quietly, He ended his nights sitting on the lower bunk, staring at the wall as if waiting for something he couldn't name. Most days passed without incident. A few inmates tried to talk to him, curious about the case, but he was polite and distant, never giving more than a few words. Officers described him as no trouble at all, and counselors noted his calm demeanor, though some days he seemed emotionally vacant. He rarely cried, rarely spoke, rarely reacted to anything. It was as if prison didn't break him. Life already had. One morning in late November, as the facility prepared for holiday staffing rotations, a male officer stopped outside Derek's cell with a thin envelope in hand. "No return address," the officer said. "Might be a card." Derek took it with a quiet nod, thanking him out of habit. The envelope was light, almost weightless, but the edges were stiff, indicating something more than paper inside. Something glossy, something deliberate. Derek opened it slowly, peeling apart the seal with trembling fingers. A single photograph slipped into his palm, landing face down. When he turned it over, his breath caught. It was the yellow Lamborghini, or rather, what remained of it. The once pristine car was mangled beyond recognition, its front end crushed inward, the hood scorched black, the headlights shattered into jagged shards that glinted under fluorescent impound lights. The windshield had collapsed inward, creating a spiderweb of jagged fractures. The bumper hung loose. The rear frame bent like soft metal. A thin police tarp covered half the vehicle, dirt and rainwater weighing it down. Whoever took the picture captured the car from an angle that highlighted the violence of its destruction. The final erasure of the gift that tore Derek's life apart. But the real horror wasn't the image. It was the message. On the back of the photo, in dark ink, someone wrote, "You were right." There was no signature, no initials, no hint of who sent it. Just those 3 words, heavy, haunting, and cruelly ambiguous. Was it sent by someone connected to Trent? One of Alyssa's friends? A stranger who followed the case too closely? Or someone who simply wanted Derek to feel another twist of pain? We will never know. And perhaps Derek never wanted to. He stared at the photograph for several minutes, his expression unreadable, his breathing uneven. For the first time in months, he closed his eyes, pressing the picture gently between his palms, as if trying to release a burden too heavy to hold. When he finally set the photo down, he didn't cry, didn't speak, didn't call the guard. He simply sat there in silence. A silence heavier than grief, heavier than regret, heavier than truth. We return to where the story began, the emotional truth beneath everything Derek did. He did not break because Alyssa bought another man a luxury car. He broke because she bought that man the future Derek spent years fighting for, on tired feet, on double shifts, on faith that loyalty meant something. And that is what destroyed him. The screen fades to black. White text appears. Trent Matthews was never charged with a crime. A pause, long enough to ache. Then the final message moves across the screen like a quiet echo. Thank you for watching this story to the end. Before you go, tell us in the comments which case you want us to cover next. Your voice guides this channel, and your engagement helps us share the stories that matter. And if you stayed through every twist and every heartbreak, drop "I'm still here" and let us know where you're watching from. Your support means the world.